welcome to Elevated, your project management podcast. We're coming from Caltech Center for Technology and Management Education, Caltech CTME, and we are bringing in a very distinguished guest, Kurt Moses. I'm going to say a little bit about Kurt's career. Full disclosure, Kurt and I met in DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C. about 10 years ago and have stayed in touch since then. Kurt comes from this wide variety of different international projects that stem from the complex, many moving parts, opportunities rife for cultural misunderstandings. And I really thought bringing him on board would help give everyday project managers, be it from aerospace or finance or international relations, a sense of the different diverse expectations that are out there. And these expectations are powered by various cultural expectations that are both implicit and explicit for all of your requirements. So Kurt comes from a storied career in international project management. He's worked in 72 countries. He's worked with over 700 governments, different states, institutions, and he told me recently that he hasn't worked in every US state except for 4 states. I'm going to be very curious during the podcast to hear about those, but his work stems from education, advanced information systems, biometrics, and more recently, various technologies within artificial intelligence. Most recently, his work centers around education and health space from Northern Europe, Middle East, Latin America, South Asia, and Africa. Kurt, the only thing I think you haven't worked in is Antarctica. So, correct me if I'm wrong. He has numerous publications, comes from Stanford University, University of Chicago for his bona fides. Kurt, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, the problem was when I first started working, nobody was going to Antarctica except penguins and a couple scientists. So it just was never on my list. I did briefly spend some time in the Arctic. I'm glad I did it then because there won't be much left in about 10 years. So
Now,
anyway,
Kurt, where are you calling from today? Are you in Washington, D.C.?
I am.
Excellent. So we'll let you begin, give a little introduction about yourself, and let's dig into it.
Okay. Can you tell me roughly how many people have logged in so far?
Got about 24.
Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
So I don't know where everyone's coming from. I mentioned to Nick today that there were a lot more hits on LinkedIn, more people looking either at me or something than I've ever had before. So I really wasn't looking for a job, but anyway, glad to see that some people are doing the homework they can. Actually, I was raised in California around Silicon Valley. So it's good to be speaking with an institution, a storied institution in that great state. One of the things that I think I can talk about, frankly, I don't think there's ever an expert in this, in this area, is some of the important issues and oftentimes special issues that arise with international or multicultural projects. Most of the projects I've done have been structural when they're dealing with governments, and they've been tactical when dealing with institutions. So with 72 countries, that also represents a variety of institutions. It's hard to say directly what the most important thing is because, frankly, every country is quite unique. And the things that often make for success or failure, and here, depending on your experience, you already know this, there's going to be a couple of key issues that actually have set the stage for the work you're doing being really appreciated the way you hope. So I'm going to try and talk about some of the things that I've seen and also some of the checklists that I actually use or have used, developed it over almost 40 years, that I found if you don't actually find a way to complete that checklist in some fashion, it always comes back and bite you. And I've got a couple projects that I could dig into a bit more that would give you some, using the old congressional approach, give them 3 facts and then tell 2 stories. And if if that doesn't win you an increase in your budget, then you need to go back to school.
Kurt,
So
I need to share with you when we first met 10 years ago. I always remembered that anyone who had worked with you or worked under you always said you would always start off a meeting saying, I have three things. And I have since found phenomenal success in my own career. If I only knew one thing, I'd say, I have three things, 3 points that I want to make. And I realized by the point I got to the third point, I will have thought of it or I would be a disaster at that point. So far, your 3 point methods worked out pretty well.
that's great to hear. I look, I usually try to have two before finding the third, but just so you know, in this case, I've actually used five, which, as your wife knows, Joy, ends up being the number I really talk about, even saying there's only three. So uh, the problem is with some of the audience I've had and the time I've had, if I say five, I lose them at two. So that's why I start with saying three.
Well,
Um,
we can probably jump into our first story. Now, you and I talked about, Kurt, there were two stories you wanted to share. One was kind of post communist Poland, fall of the wall, and one was a more recent technology implementation that you did in Tanzania, specifically Zanzibar, I believe.
well, actually, both Zanzibar and the mainland.
Hmm.
In basically in '91, what used to be German Tanganyika merged with Zanzibar. Actually, it was '64 because that's when independence was declared. But they actually worked out some of the working methods as late as 1991. Zanzibar was treated as a almost autonomous province within Tanzania. So I think what I'm wondering here, I could tell this story. Let me go to slide number 3, which might help set the context. There we go. Um, I mentioned earlier a checklist that I've sort of worked out over time. Now, my primary work has been using technology in an education and health context. Because it's been 40 years, I mean, it really started in the 80s. The use of a technology for project activities itself was an innovation. I mean, there's always been technology going back to the wheel. But what I mean is that the technology, some of the major modern technologies were evolving during this period. And one aspect to this, and by the way, they will keep evolving. There's no question. Uh, the introduction, I would say, in the modern period that I experienced was that about every 10 years, I'd have to not only migrate the technology, but migrate the interactions that actually made the best use of that technology. And that's why I'm talking about, in effect, five issues. A few of these are things that don't change. What an international or multicultural issue really requires is that, in addition to, let's just say, the technical work that you or your firm has been hired to conduct, you've got an extra set of complications. Anybody who's worked in bilingual or trilingual environments knows that you can say one thing in one language in the best fashion you know how and find out it really doesn't translate very well into the other two. And that most people, of course, are fundamentally working in their, almost all, they're working in their home language. So if you, I mean, at one point there were 6,000 identifiable separate linguistic groups. I think it's now down to 3,000. And de facto, let's just say there's four that are big, for example, for the UN, namely English, French, Spanish, Arabic. The Germans never made it. The Dutch haven't made it, etc. So within a Western European context, and of course now because of the negotiations and contributions from China, Chinese is one of the UN languages into which many things are originally translated. So in terms of your dealings in a project in a multicultural context, one of the issue is the context itself. Um, most projects start off by having a set of goals, things they hope to accomplish. And what I've discovered is that in almost every situation, even if you're working in a project that's itself in a hierarchy, say in a corporate hierarchy, there's something going on in the interaction between your corporation and the country. And that's actually what the underlying goal of it is. Your project may have been negotiated either by yourself or by a corporation to accomplish a political goal or at least an economic goal, which has itself a specific history. I found it's been very important to have a pretty good sense of what that is. It's usually involved in the goal statement and whatever, and spending some time with that is really critical because, very frankly, in some countries, they hide their real goal while expressing a whole different one. Um, I found this particularly in countries that are anxious and feeling somewhat defensive. They will give very high sounding goals, very high sounding objectives and hopes. And the reality is actually a bit different. Um, One of the ways this translates is I've always asked, even in what seems like the simplest project, what are the political deadlines? What's the point at which, well, first off, everyone's got a boss, everybody. And the boss in some more democratic environments could be the people. But of course, your understanding of that's going to be interpreted and renegotiated and re expressed by the people who have leadership or whatever responsibility. So getting to what the political deadlines are is really quite important because that's the one that comes in to bite you. You set up project deadlines, and in some ways that's even more manageable because you're in a project framework. But actually, there's an outer frame to that project, and that's a political deadline. And that often will change all the dynamics in the project itself. Um, so there's a second part, and this is the three parts that I think are really critical. It's people, process, and technology, particularly in a project context. Um, the the first question really is who has real authority. Um, you're going to find times in the implementation or even in the planning stages where you're not really sure whose word can actually be trusted. Um, this varies, by the way, but even in highly developed countries, and I'm talking usually higher income, but very well educated environments, Poland being a classic example for me, superb technical preparation, highly theoretical, a cadre of really good people in the sense of articulate and well trained. But often in the case when I was there in Poland, almost all of the training was theoretical. And that had,
Kurt, what year was this original Poland project? Can you lay a little bit of context on what you were doing, what some of the goals were, and kind of what the regional stability at that time was?
well, I came in right after Lech Walesa came to power, when Poland transitioned basically from a Russian, USSR satellite to basically an independent country. And that was 1991. The process itself lasted, well, in fact, in some ways it's still going on. But at that time, from my experience, it lasted 5 to 7 years. Um, and what happens in a politically unstable or transitional environment, um, everything is moving around you, everything. And well, actually, then I guess I could tell part of the story. When I first drove into Warsaw, I had a really good cab driver who spoke some English. And I said, "So, how's it going?" I said, because this was my first time in Poland. Some of you who've met anyone who speaks Polish, you're looking at a wunderkind. I've usually been able to count in every language of every country I've been in. I still can't count in Polish. And it's a devilish language, I think, even for somebody with other linguistic skills. Um, we went by a building which had massive amounts of scaffolding around it. And I said, by the way, what is that? Because, by the way, the Soviets had actually left town, and the flea markets were full of surplus Soviet gear that all the occupying troops had sold on their way back to the Soviet Union. They used it to exchange for washing machines and everything else because that was shortage. We went by the building with the scaffolding. I said, "What is that?" He said, "Oh, that's the Soviet headquarters." I said, "Really? And why the scaffolding?" He said, "Well, it's been there actually 12 years." And I said, 12 years? He said, "Yes, they wanted it painted." And this was just a 3-story building and not that big. And I said, "Well, what happened?" "Well, they needed to know that we really didn't want them here." And within a week, because I came back a week, the scaffolding was gone and the building had been entirely repainted. So the scaffolding sat for 12 years. I said, there's a lesson here that there are people that are changing. And, um, and that's a real factor. Uh, just now, I'll go into a little bit more on Poland, if that makes sense, Nick. Itself, it's about 37 million people. Right now, it's got a GDP, gross domestic product, which is about $1 trillion. It puts it actually at the low end, the emerging end of the EU requirement. Um, Poland was blessed, and I was part of that. There was a massive amount of reinvestment in Poland as soon as it changed sides. So you had the EU, which had been, well, EU was still in transition then. The Schengen group was there, and they had organized things. Um, they asked me to help automate and reform social welfare, health, and education. Luckily, I had a really good team. I wasn't responsible for all simultaneously. The first one was social welfare. And it had some characteristics, which those of you who may have been familiar with the Soviet system, but also know about a number of systems that adopted a more socialist approach to governance. And what that means is that almost all the services that relate to the human environment, okay, families, vacations, education, etc. In Poland, they were all located in the workplace, which was largely industrial. So, if you're going to change from a centrally mandated system where you were given quotas, not sales figures. There was basically no selling. You were told by a central planning group, which was in Poland but guided by Moscow, you were told how much you were supposed to produce. And that was your major metric. And by the way, at the time, and this is the 90s, quality wasn't that big an issue, which is why everybody who had any money in Poland would buy Swedish furniture or Finnish furniture, as just one example, how they would do their houses. So you had people that were unfamiliar with selling anything and also with serious quality control. So the other part, and you'll see this, in fact, you could see it in Tanzania and some other countries who adopted a socialist, excuse me, a socialist approach. Um, Training becomes incredibly over specialized. One of the things I discovered in social welfare, but which inhabited each of the sectors, was that there were in the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, which some of you may have heard of, you know it's outdated even in the US. For the Soviet Union, the Dictionary of Occupational Titles had 9,300 entries. They had 9,300 separate um, operational categories for workers. The United States got by for almost 50 years with 2,300, in effect, 1/3. Now, we know it's out of date for certain technology things, but think about it. When you had a welder in Poland, they were either a ship welder in steel or an automobile welder in steel and aluminum, or a welder for electronic parts, or et cetera, et cetera. And there was very little crossover, even in a subject like welding. So what happened is you had highly specialized people who couldn't adapt very quickly. Once the economic motivations changed, then things began to alter. So how does this affect things? I ended up working with a group of about 25 people in the social welfare area. I was given 9 Polish counterparts and then 9 other people, 3 from Holland, 3 from France, 2 from Germany, and 1 from Luxembourg. The bank at this, the World Bank, was funding this effort. So we come to one of the issues, context and people. And I use the term here, what language do they understand? The Polish were extremely well educated. It was a highly theoretical education, and they all spoke English. So did the Dutch, so did the French, and also so the person from Luxembourg. I sat in one meeting in which we were dealing with how we had to restructure the system. The goal for me was to just serve as a referee. So 9 on each side talked for an hour, all in English. Finally, in the 59th minute, I said, gentlemen, it was all gentlemen at that time, I don't have a clue what you just said. I have no idea what happened in this meeting. You are all speaking English. I think I'm the only native speaker in the room. I have no idea what you said. So, could we go back to drawing some pictures? And let's start with the simplest concepts, the simplest picture. And until everybody nods their head, yes, they got it. Okay. And you're allowed to talk to your neighbor if you don't think you got it. I said, because otherwise this is just going to be blithering. And
Correct.
they all
This
agreed.
sounds like diplomatic Pictionary.
Yes, exactly. No, it was. It was. Now, and that was a characteristic of an international project, in my view, and which has been repeated in place after place. And so you had two really important issues here. Everybody wanted to make it clear that they were highly educated and spoke English, because English was the gateway, of course, to good jobs, high positions, and the transition to a better economy. Um, Most of them were translating in their heads. And each academic system, even at that time, was quite different. So how a concept was explained and the direction, et cetera, were all different. So you couldn't just understand, you couldn't just listen to these things and wonder what was going on. Anyone who's done IKEA furniture, who's ever put together IKEA furniture and seen the instructions, which are not just pictorial, but in English, perhaps translated by 7 different translators from various countries, kind of understands what I mean. It was the same thing even in these projects. Um, I use this term. It's German, but it's kind of made up. It's Spitzengefühl. The Spitzengefühl literally means the touch at the fingertip. Meetings like the one I just described is getting a fingertip view of how things are actually happening. Because my experience in that one meeting in Poland was being repeated in other sectors. Um, the other part that I think is, well, one other quick aside. This was a previously communist based country. Within 3 months of coming in, while there were 4 million communist members when I first entered the country, there were only 40,000 within 6 months. One of the things that everybody needed or talked about was, could you tell us how to run a meeting? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, normally we attend meetings, but they're all scripted. So that they asked me they said something like Robert's Rules of Order. We understand in the UK and the US you use that. So we got 4,000 copies of Robert's Rules of Order translated into Polish. And it was a sellout. We were giving them out like nothing. What that basically said was that the authority dynamics and the procedural issues were very context specific. And that has to do with how projects end up getting done. And the final thing I would suggest, which many of you know already, in Silicon Valley, the the metronome is based on break things fast and get it fixed. So it's break it fast and get it fixed. Governments are not used to doing that. And as we're learning in the US right now, it's not always the best approach in a government. Governments have a special role, and it has a lot to do with the people who are in that government and who are in that population. At the same time, being able to implement a bit and do it very sequentially, carefully, and do a weekly assessment of whether this is working. So very tight control in that sense on the implementation side, as opposed to, frankly, some countries, and I've run into it in Saudi Arabia, and it's not a critique of Saudi Arabia, but it's a reflection on the outlook. In the case of Saudi Arabia and some other countries that have come up in a certain tradition, when something doesn't work when it's first implemented, they say, well, the plan is wrong, let's throw it out and start over. And for most projects, include highly technical projects, that is a deadly, deadly outcome. And what it does is it also destroys all the underlying work that's gone on building trust and clarity. So I'm sorry that that's probably simple-minded, but what I've found is systematic, carefully controlled implementation with a lot of review, not to blame someone, but to look at real effectiveness, is absolutely critical. If you haven't done it in a domestic context where, quote, everybody really does speak English or whatever the base language is, you still want to keep doing that. And we know that people are always in a hurry, but what you have to do is hurry in a very thoughtful way. So um, that also, by the way, goes to process. In an international or a multicultural context, the things that you think are pain points are often not the ones that are the real pain points. And that's because a particular culture values things differently. Looking for pain points, the ones that people are less willing to talk about, is really critical. And particularly when you're in the public sector and you're in the government, understanding, again, how it's really working at the, if you will, the grassroots level, where the intended audience is fundamental. And as somebody told me, they said in most cases, and we discovered this in the US, in most cases, the technology actually works okay. What's what's been messed up is the implementation. And that's often just a reflection of not knowing what the microculture is, not understanding where the pain points are, and by the way, not understanding what preceded what you're doing. Um, Look, in the Western world, at least, in the Western world, we're trained in diagnostic, which is pulling things apart. And also, if you're educated, by and large, you get promoted by finding problems with things. You can get promoted by saying that doesn't work and we know why. So you get promoted. You don't really get promoted by saying, you know what, the stuff they've got going here in this area, it's working pretty well. We just need to tweak it slightly, which gives you the benefit, particularly in a multicultural situation where, frankly, most people want to be proud of their work. You give them kudos and you give them attaboys that are genuine. You say, no matter how this happened, this part of things works pretty well. Let's see if we can keep it and make an adjustment. And then you can still often get the kind of reform you're looking for just by understanding that. Um, One other side issue, and it will put the issue of systematic, careful implementation. There is a statement, it came from me during some transformations in Africa, particularly Namibia. The deputy prime minister of Namibia at that point, in a major planning effort, said, please, let us not make the perfect the enemy of the good. And that's often a hard judgment call, but not making the perfect the enemy of the good in most situations, and I'm not sure about sending rockets up, but as we know, there were some instances where a person who's been under a lot of criticism recently did understand we could spend a lot of time on the ground making it perfect, or we could do the best we could and then see if it actually flies. Now, that means it's going to blow up every so often. But luckily, most things in life are not like rocket science. Now, I'm probably speaking to a bunch of now insulted aeronautical engineers. But that's why you can say, look, well, it's not rocket science, looking at others saying, but I'm a rocket scientist. So um, let me move on to Tanzania. I think we've used about 30 minutes and nobody but me has really asked a question. Nick, Mike, are we okay?
Yep, we're fine to proceed to Tanzania, and then we can ask questions afterwards. I know I've been jotting down a couple with pen and paper over here, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Um, Tanzania, I was in Tanzania off and on for almost 8 years. We started in 2015, exited there in 2020. It's a country of about 67 million people. It's got a GDP of about 80 billion. By the way, the U.S. gross domestic product is 28 trillion. And the second biggest country, China, updated, is $18 trillion. And that's followed by the next wealthiest country, which is Japan, at 4.6 trillion. So we're talking about a country with $80 billion for a GDP with 67 million people. Okay, well that's the same size as California and Texas together. So populations, California and Texas, with a GDP that is some minuscule fraction of the combined GDP of California and Texas, which is combined about $7 trillion. So same population, 7 trillion versus 80 billion. Anyway, um, Tanzania became independent in 64, shortly after Kenya. They graduated from a socialist economy. They graduated at considerable cost. Julius Nyerere had studied the Soviet and studied the socialist models, and it fit very well with many of the African precepts, which began as tribal, actually as it did in the U.S., helping everybody. Everybody's in the same boat. They help one another. So when a formal government comes in, the goal was to make sure that everybody benefited. Now, that worked in some cases, didn't work in others. A lot of stuff had to change, but interestingly, when we came in, there was a national cell network that could support 3G and 4G cell work. And in fact, cell phones were quite were in considerable number. And by the way, they came in because 4 cell companies were allowed to sell cell phones and install towers, et cetera, et cetera. Our job was basically to automate um, attendance in all of the primary and secondary schools. It was to monitor student down to the student level, student progress, academic progress, to monitor teacher performance, and to do that daily and at the worst weekly. And to do that given an existing structure which went which went basically cell, district, um, county, region, of which there were about 9, and then head office. Um, they wanted to do it badly because they wanted to make sure teachers were providing everybody almost an equivalent level of education. So we worked there 6 years. We had funding from the World Bank. We had some private funding. The British were heavily involved. So going back to context and people, we had 6 bosses simultaneously. And 2 of the bosses were providing money, and the other 3 were watching everything. We were constantly working in at least 2 languages, English and Kiswahili. Kiswahili, of course, is basically an Arabic version of Swahili, a native African tongue. Secondly, there were 2 big parts. There was the mainland of Tanzania, and then there was Zanzibar, and that merger had taken place in 64. Zanzibar was virtually independent, had about 500 schools. Zanzibar was predominantly Muslim. Most of Tanzania was either Christian or, in some cases, local synergistic religions. Um, Almost everybody was fluent in Kiswahili. Most people understood English, but it had to be very carefully done. Um, so there were at least three things which go back to process. Tanzania actually had a pretty good process. It was cumbersome, it was slow, but students were being taught, students were showing up. It varied by region. Students were getting, particularly at the primary level, pretty much the same level of resources. They were getting similar numbers of textbooks, etc. Our job was to make sure that that all happened and could be, in this case, centrally provided. So one of the things we did was to look at the whole system, figured out that an awful lot of people were involved in needless paperwork. So we did, over the course of 3 years, automation of the paperwork, believe it or not, which gave us early wins. It built trust in what was happening. And the other part was it began to give voice to the lowest people. It gave them a chance to say what the pain points really were. The second thing that happened is with a 2G, with a 3G and 4G network, we could do a certain amount of internet work. In the British system, paperwork moved from the school up to the center. That often took 2 months. By that time, the school was halfway through the term. So what happened was concerns about supplies and learning materials, we sent it via the net directly to the head office, which had the money and the distribution centers, and actually, because it was a somewhat socialist system, had a pretty good pretty good process, centralized process. So we used what they had, and we reversed, or literally reversed the flow of information. Things the school reported went straight to the center, and then it trickled down at a slightly slower rate to the other levels that were responsible. It began to change how they did things. Um, One of the interesting things was the president had autocratic tendencies. He's since passed away, so I can say this without further damage to my household and hopefully my life. He was having strongly autocratic tendencies. He said at one point, "I want to see the the attendance of every single school that this government's supporting." That was 25,000 schools. So imagine getting daily attendance report from 25,000 schools within 6 hours of it being reported. His desire to get attendance daily. We were told after 3 days, he said, I don't think we should keep doing this. So it changed things a lot. It put the information where it should be. One of the interesting parts on the technology was everybody knew how to use a cell phone, almost. We were able to move them to basically a tablet technology, which we got in bulk. At that time, I think it was like $150 a tablet, and we got it down to 70 by dealing directly with the manufacturer, in this case, Samsung. We also had to write specific contracts with all four cell companies because they weren't working together, they were all competing. We managed to get a connection for every single school in Tanzania and Zanzibar for 50 cents a month, $6 a year. And we did that by using the central power of the government to not only remake the national market, but also give everybody, in effect, an assured amount of income. It meant that the total bill, because remember, this is a country that's not that rich, the total bill for a year's worth of connectivity was $120,000. And during the transition period, donors could actually support that because most won't do continuing work. So I can't say that the whole. Oh, and the third part was they had centralized all the IT services and had been given really important equipment. We found, for purposes of what we were doing, using Amazon web services, the cloud, was absolutely critical because the uprate of that was 6 nines. Okay, the amount of time that the cloud ever went down, that was a 6 9 performance. The We got the government to upgrade the pipes between Tanzania and the closest server, which it turned out was in Europe. So they paid extra for that, but the banks loved it. So we got the private sector to push for the government to make that allocation, and in some cases co-sponsored it. So we were able to improve the internet the internet capacity, which actually, because all of the four cell service firms, were now collaborating on a national effort, made a great difference. It transformed in a previous socialist country where technology and information control was critical, okay, and usually it was to depress things. We still got it to work. There was no excuse that they couldn't connect to every part. So it actually made a political difference. Um, the outcome, we were able, particularly in Tanzania, to balance short-term and long-term outcomes. And it turns out that core parts of that whole system we left in 2020 are still in operation, even without external support. So um, that's it.
Great. Thank you for both of the stories about Poland and Zanzibar. I've got a couple questions about each of them, but I open it up to different folks who have any questions that they might want to ask. I'll start it off with the first one, and we'll see which ones roll in. So maybe we'll stay on Zanzibar. And so you talked about having six different bosses, being international donors and various governments heads. How do you deal with not having a certain amount of scope creep seep in when you're working on these projects with so many different stakeholders?
Yeah. Excellent question, Nick. Really. Yes, it was a constant battle, constant. And as you and I had discussed, when you're dealing with a project, and this is the one thing the same the world over, there are three things that matter: the results, which is your scope, time, and budget. And as soon as you sign the contract, and depending on how forceful the government is, or your client, or the donor in this case, who, by the way, has just gotten a new set of bosses and a new president. Um, the job of the manager, the key manager, hopefully with the alignment of everybody else who has more power than you do, was to hold it to the original scope. And in that sense, constantly offer trade offs, saying, okay, we understand that. This is not the way it was designed, budgeted, or timed for. Here are your three options. We can stop doing this, which you had in the original scope. We can repurpose a portion of it. So here's what it'll be for this amendment, et cetera, et cetera. So the management part, it's the most critical thing actually, is scope creep, because usually your budget is pretty well fixed. Um, and time is a little more flexible, but that goes way back up to the context. What are the political deadlines? Because whenever you change the time, somebody's ox gets gored.
Now, building on that, when you're in country, so say you're in Tanzania and you have a change in administration, regardless of a change in administration in the United States, how do you
Yes.
deal with that?
Uh, this goes back to context. You try to make a lot of friends who warn you that this is happening, and you try to meet quietly with the opposition staff and party if it's done on that basis. And by the way, it does depend on how that occurs. Um, in the course of 40 years, I've been shot at 5 times. Uh, those were countries where either in the locale I was dealing or at the national level, the transformation into a different regime was fairly tense. And there is a cutoff point, and I don't know. I was just looking on the chat line. Um, well, there are a number of people from places where they know that some changes have been violent, at least on certain areas. And anytime you're in an international environment where there's been some political instability, there's usually a cutoff. You simply say, we have to stop this because too many people are endangered.
Yeah.
Um, and in this, clearly it's not happening in all of Europe, but there are some times in Europe you just say, look, the situation on the ground has changed so dramatically, we just can't do this. It would be a waste of money, by the way. And in the contract itself, you try to build that in. In our case, where stuff was really tense, I mean, I've come in after the end of two civil wars. There usually is a fairly substantial international presence. And depending on who's the sponsor for all that, they will have a cutoff. And the other part is we always made provisions for evacuation of the teams, all of them. I mean, I was in, as one example, Liberia when Ebola broke out, and we came back in early, but I only did that because the entire team would have access at that time to one of three airplanes in the entire world that had Cat 4 lab conditions inside the plane and staff. And the problem, and that what that meant is that the Ebola couldn't escape, and that if you were actually diagnosed with it, there was a crew of three, all in hazmat suits. And the big reason there were only three planes is because after every flight, which was $250,000 per flight, no matter what the country, it took 3 days to clean and refilter the entire plane.
So thinking as a project manager,
Uh,
you're putting together a proposal for a country like Liberia, where you know that there is a history of widespread infectious diseases like Ebola. And how do you provision that into your cost estimates? Maybe this is too kind of administrative task type of question, but how do you like what is the net present value of $250,000 plane ride and the probability that you might have to take it? Or is that just such a fringe use case that that's something that's kind of put into these the clause of being an act of God?
no, you purchase international insurance. Okay, you pay the premium up front, and you charge the sponsor of that. I mean, you could think about Iraq when people were coming in, particularly in the transition period. Parts of Iraq were clear, parts of them weren't. You you set up the conditions, barriers, protocols, and you purchase international health insurance, and you also agree ahead of time. Well, I could go on to even wartime because I was in Afghanistan just before the transition. I was in there three times. In those extreme instances, we had security teams, and they were built into the project itself. And for the health issue, as I just said, the we only went in with a provision that there was both funding and a protocol when evacuation should take place, who was responsible for doing it. If you're working with a major corporation, almost all of them have dealt with it at one point or another. You have a security slash wellness is the wrong term, but basically employee safeguard group. Literally, you'll have a head of security that deals with in-country situations. I mean, we ended up as it got more essential that we do that. We built in the case of a nonprofit FHI, which was the last big firm, which I don't know, they're $1 billion. They used to be $1 billion a year, frankly, with about 5,000 people. We added an entire security staff, and their job was to monitor all local conditions for hazard to employees and team members.
Are there certain lessons learned in the past from managing projects with large security contingencies that stand out to you where, hey, this is a mistake that we don't want to make again, and we're going to put it into the language of a proposal or a contract so it'll never happen again? Like, as a project manager, how do you look for those types of, I don't know, long tail, low probability situations that might happen once in a decade?
Um, you talk to as many people as you can that have been on the ground, and to always, and this is the other part about international people, a big surprise, people don't always tell the truth. They don't always tell the truth, sometimes because they don't know it, sometimes because it's very limited, the view, and sometimes because they don't want to for other
Mm,
reasons. And you'll have this in any environment where there've been, particularly where there's been violence as part of the transition. Um, uh, and then it's taken me a couple of years to get over long-term paranoia. Um, but I have to say, frankly, that the best thing you can do is to make as many friends as you can. Because in at least three countries, I won't say they saved my life. That somebody with an international background, you're not a target they really want to go after a lot because it's noisy and it can backfire badly. So that was always different. I was always much more worried about field staff that we had employed.
mm,
And we know what's that like with the experience in Afghanistan. We know what it's like in other countries where people have been pulled out rapidly and some of the local staff not given the same level of care.
yeah.
And that's emotionally really
Yeah.
hard. So, um, and by the way, if you're in a good organization, private sector, nonprofit, or for profit, for example, a Hess Oil Company, we were in Equatorial Guinea. Hess Oil Company gave us some of the best cerebral malaria test kits I've ever seen. They just handed them out to us. And they said, we take care of everybody here. And they were prepared to evacuate. They built it right into their profit margin. And that, for me, on an international basis, was the sign of a good firm.
So jumping into some of the questions we've got rolling in here, I'll kind of do them in no particular order, maybe the order of kind of what we're talking about. Um, Talking about blowback, we've all had, be it from small projects where we need to go over a stakeholder's head to kind of who the real boss was. What are some recommendations for going over someone's head? So if you need a decision, you need approval, but you don't want to anger the person whom you're about to go over. And any
Uh,
stories or anecdotes to answer that question are more than welcome, Kurt.
well, I go back to making friends. Okay. Um, you sh- you don't really want to go into a situation unless you can have it. Oh, I just froze.
You're fine. We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh,
But
okay. But it's a really
do
bad
know
image.
that, yeah, do know that you are frozen in a very exalted state.
Yeah, but God, it's a bad picture. Okay. My mouth is open again.
Well, at least your name's not under it, you know.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, Nick. Um, one of the things I've always tried to do is have everybody on the team be really truthful um, with everybody. Um, and the reaction will vary depending on the culture. Some will think that's really naive. So that's how the truth needs to be carefully structured. But they need to understand that you are really looking for a win-win. And for example, if you're going to go over someone's head, you'll usually say, look, you say, I know this decision is difficult for you to make because there's a lot of factors. Can I help you with this with your boss? Um, and by the way, I know some people that also know the boss. And so you'll assume they're stuck not because they're blocking you or because they're indecisive, but because they're right at the margins of their authority. And there are ways to, if you will, keep their dignity while at the same time allowing them to continue to move forward.
And this is coinciding with another question is understanding how to keep someone's dignity can have a lot of different cultural misunderstandings based on kind of the different background that they're from. how do you learn those cultural differences fast? Like, so are able to interpret context quickly. Is it just time in country? Is it, like you said, having friends in multiple countries? What are your like 3 to 5 Kurt Moses points for interpreting context?
Wow. Um, well, the first part is I generally read about 6 books if I'm going new into a country. Um, I mean, so I'll look at the CIA fact book. I'll go through as many of the World Bank reports as I can, because even when the bank is not effective, and this happens for a variety of reasons, they usually do pretty good research. I will try to talk to at least 3 or 4 people who've worked there before, um, and I'll try to get from them what are the pain points, what are the triggers. I mean, look, to use a couple small examples, which will often be forgiven. In Arab countries, showing the soles of your feet, even when you're sitting down, is considered a sign of disrespect. Eating with the left hand is is a no-no. You'll be forgiven as an outsider if you're, for example, like me, from obviously not from there. um, the local customs. Actually, some of the things you do as a tourist that was going to spend more time. Um, the third part is there are certain trigger words or trigger concepts that might show up in your speech pattern, references to something that mean exactly the opposite. They reference back a time when the entire country was against it, and you spoke of it favorably because that's the context you came out of. Um, the fourth part is you make some local friends and you say, look, I'm going to be really awkward. Please correct me. Um, the fifth part, which and it's important, it's related there, is the concepts of whether the bureaucracy or the structures you're in are helping or hurting. Countries that are going through transitions often have lots of workarounds. They have to in order to operate. And you have a delicate situation because you're usually brought in to fix the problem, but in the process, you've got to allow things to keep going. So that's where you're constantly looking at what workaround are they pursuing, and you try to figure out a way to say, okay, let's make this a little more organized. A small example, Liberia. Everybody carried 3 IDs, 3, and their name wasn't always spelled the same in each ID. Why did they do that? Was because not everybody respected the same ID. So we got another group to actually institute a national ID card for teachers. It took 2 years because there were 15,000 teachers and each had to be vetted. And a lot of politicians had put teachers on the payroll. So you had teachers collecting 2 and 3 payrolls. So in short, we had to do a parallel effort, but to sort of clean that up to make it work better. There isn't a magic thing. Um, you break bread with people. You make sure that you have a chance for 1-on-3, 1-on-2, 1-on-1 conversations, and you can actually do that fairly quickly if they know you're sincere and that you really want to understand in order to make things better. Um, Coming in from a technical perspective only, where you say, I've got your solution. Now just get out of the way. I have never worked in an environment where that's worked well. It In my view, the world just doesn't work like that, particularly if you want something to last. Now, you may not have time to make it last the way you hope. And by the way, there is a limit to how much change different cultures can endure. I tried to leave, and this is international development. I tried to leave after 5 years to be gone and to simply be an interested observer after that, because countries and institutions as well take some time to refresh, to internalize, to really come to grips with it. And by the way, there's 20 to 30% that will never change. They're going to be the resistors. I mean, in any project, you'll be lucky, but you'll get 20% who are really willing to change. You've got you've got about 60% who are going to see how it goes. Make sure the rules are clear and yeah, okay, I'll do it if it seems to help. And then you're going to have 20, maybe 30% who say, no way in hell. And and that's just life.
Well, Kurt, that's a lot of questions that we asked you, a lot of stories that and anecdotes that you were able to give. I can't thank you enough for joining this session. For those of you who are interested in advancing your project management goals, Caltech Center for Technology Management Education offers a whole variety of different project management certificates. One of them I want to highlight is our Advanced Project Management Cert. It really dives into various different electives that you can take. And so it's kind of the pick your own adventure, kind of from the complex projects that Kurt Moses and I have been talking about, all the way down to some more of the nitty gritty details on some of the more administrative and goal oriented based tasks. One last question, Kurt, before we sign off is if somebody wants to get a hold of you, how can they reach out?
Slide 4. Stacy.
Stacy, if we can bring up slide 4, I think it has our contact details.
Yeah, I'm also yeah. I'm not looking for a job, but my cell phone is all over the world, so it never stops. So
Good.
I'm happy to chat with anybody who wants to. Um,
Sure. I think the
Stacy, is it
slide's
there?
coming up.
Go one more
There
slide.
we go.
Go, yeah, there you go.
One more up,
No,
slide 4.
go back.
There it is.
There you are.
All right, so you might be getting requests from all over the world or spam from all over the world. I can't
Yeah.
forecast
Yes.
that.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
Kurt, best wishes from Pasadena, California to Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And everybody, thank you for returning to Elevated. If you're a return listener or if it's your first time, welcome. We hope to see you next month. Thank you very much.